All right, so I gave the first presentation about this on Tuesday at the KBW, and some interesting things have happened since then. Obviously, the markets have traded a bit weaker since then, and my own thesis is that the market, at least the U.S. long-end bond market, is rejecting the Fed cuts of 25 basis points. And so I think equities are going to trade lower, crypto is going to trade lower for a bit, and then it becomes incumbent upon Trump and Secretary Scott Bessent to print more money and get lower rates at the Fed. And so this presentation is even more apropos because we need to understand how they are going to gain control of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And so this is the presentation called 4.7. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what do we have to go on to understand how the U.S. authorities want to think about how they are going to change monetary policy? And so I like to study a lot of economic history. And for those of you who don't know, there was something called the Treasury and Fed Accords that happened during World War II. And so I'm sure, as everyone is very cognizant of, when a government goes to war, what do? They print a lot of money, and inflation goes crazy, and they financially repress everyone. And they did the same thing in America. So from 1942 to 1951, obviously the U.S. entered World War II in 1942, and they needed to finance the war. They needed to print a fuck ton of money to build, planes and bombs and pay the soldiers and all that kind of stuff. And, the interest rates were too high at the time for the government to afford to do all of this financing for the war. So the Fed and the Treasury combined forces, and the Fed would print the money that the government needed to finance itself. And this was called the Treasury-Fed Accords of 1942 to 1951. What happened? They did yield curve control. So the Federal Reserve fixed the short end of the yield curve at 0.3% on Treasury bills. And then on the long end, they fixed 10 to 25-year bonds at 2.5%. And so what they did was they created a very steep yield curve. It helped financial institutions, and most importantly, it helped the Treasury issue lots of debt at the time and be funded at an affordable rate. Okay. So here is a graphical representation of the yield curve of 1951 versus today. Now, obviously, I made this chart about a week ago, so don't hold me to the numbers. But what can we see here? So obviously, at a general level, interest rates were much lower during World War II than they are today. And most importantly, if you can see here, Treasury bill rates, which are around 4%. So Treasury bill is a less than 1 year maturity Treasury debt security, were much higher than 0.3% here in 1951. And over here, the most important part, which is where the Treasury finances itself, or would like to finance itself, obviously issuing long-term bonds. This is at 2.5%, and I think this morning the 10-year is about 4.19%, and the 30-year is about 4.8%, something thereabouts. And so when Scott Bessent talks about how he wants to change monetary policy, what he's saying, I believe, in subtle terms, is that he wants to take this yield curve here and move it down to something that looks like this. Because when you have a yield curve that looks like this, then a lot of things become easier, especially when you want to finance the reindustrialization of America, which is a polite way of saying that America wants to build more bombs to bomb more people. Right, so how does yield curve control work? In the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, there's something called the third mandate. And if you've been watching mainstream financial press, the recent Fed board member, Stephen Moran, spoke about this. He said that the Fed is a third mandate. The first two mandates are full employment and a stable price level. The third mandate, which is actually in the 1913 Act, talks about how the Fed should ensure a moderate rate of interest for government bonds. Now, what does moderate mean? It means whatever the fuck that they want it to mean. And so for moderate means I want it cheaper for Trump and for Bessent. So how do they manipulate the short end, the Treasury bill rate? So one tool that they have is to lower the interest rate on excess reserves. So if you're a large bank like JP Morgan or Citibank or Bank of America, you can take your excess cash, you can park it with the Fed, and they're essentially going to pay you Fed funds. And this is called the interest on excess reserves. You can lower the rate on the discount window. That's when I give the government some collateral and I borrow money from it in the discount window. And the key thing to note here is that there's something called the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and they control these two rates of interest. So if Trump and Besson are able to control this board, then they can control the short end of the yield curve. When you move out to the long end on the Treasury bond market, the Fed controls the long end using the System Open Market account, the SOMA account. This is essentially the Fed's balance sheet. And this is what we've been tracking ever since 2008 when the Fed started quantitative easing in response to the global financial crisis. And so when a yield curve control is enacted, and I'm sure if you've looked at what the Bank of Japan has been doing since the early 2000s, the Fed essentially says, I will grow my balance sheet to whatever level is necessary to buy bonds until the yields go below the cap that me and the Treasury Secretary have set. And the key thing here is that to control the SOMA account, the balance sheet, Trump needs to control the Federal Open Market Committee. And I'll get into how these two boards interact with each other and how Trump can gain control of these. Okay, so if you've read one of my essays called Buffalo Bill, my new nickname for U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is Buffalo Bill Bessent. Comes from the movie Silence of the Lambs in the early 90s. And he has something which I have dubbed QE for poor people. So in the quantitative easing that we're very familiar with in Japan, in the United States, in the European Union, in Korea as well, is where the central bank essentially creates money, and this money goes to the large financial institutions, the large banks. And what do the large banks do? They buy bonds and stocks in the market. This helps large companies who are able to access the institutional capital markets to issue cheap debt. But if you are a bank, a small bank, and you depend on a very steeply sloped yield curve, and you lend to small and medium-sized enterprises that make real things and employ real people, then you can't actually compete with the Fed and how it's generating credit. And so what we've seen from 2008 until the present all over the world is that small and medium-sized enterprises are unable to get credit, especially in the United States and in other places around the world. And so Bessent has a problem with this. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he basically said that the Fed is a generation of income inequality. It's not helping American industry build itself up to produce the weapons that we need to fight our adversaries. And essentially what he wants to do is to unshackle the small and medium-sized banks, the regional banks, allow them to issue credit to the industries that are going to employ American workers and build the weapons that he needs them to build. And this is all part of the yield curve, which I'll get to in a second. So here's a quick chart of how steep the yield curve is. And so in 1942 to 1951, the yield curve was about 2% spread. So if I'm a bank, I pay a little bit. I lend long at a much higher rate, very profitable. Right now, and you've seen this in bank stocks, right? The net interest margins are very slim because the difference between a long-term bond and a short-term bond is not that large, and so it's very hard for them to make money making loans. And so what Bessent wants to do is steepen the yield curve, lower interest rates, allow small banks to lend to small businesses, and then that's going to help employ people and build bombs. So the first board, Federal Board of Governors. There's 7 members. They're permanent members. They're appointed by the president. I think they serve 12-year terms. And this board is responsible for setting the interest rate on excess reserves. It's also kind of responsible for setting the discount window rate. And most importantly, the Fed Board of Governors elects the 12 district bank presidents who vote on the FOMC. And the FOMC, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with, this is the board chaired by Jerome Powell. You need to have 7 out of 12 voting members to enact policy. And this sets the Fed's funds rate, which we're all familiar with, and manages the balance sheet, the System Open Market account. So this is a infographic to describe who is politically aligned with which party. So if you see here in blue, these are all appointees of Biden or Obama, and who are both Democrats, Team Blue Democrats. The 2 members that are supporters of Trump are Bowman and Waller. We know that because they dissented in the July meeting for a 25 basis point cut. Recently, a member, Cooler, she resigned abruptly. We don't know why. She was replaced by Stephen Moran, who was just confirmed by the Senate about, I think, last week. And the contentious seat here for Trump to get 4 is Lisa Cook. And she has been accused of mortgage fraud. And I believe that by the end of the year, she will have resigned or she'll face prosecution by the criminal authorities in the United States. It's definitely politically motivated, but it doesn't matter. Trump needs to get 4 votes on this board so that he can control policy. And so how does the Federal Board of Governors interact with the FOMC? So as we know, Trump wants really cheap money, and he wants it yesterday. And so the 25 basis point cut that happened last week was definitely not enough. He wants more than that. So is there a way, if he has control of the Fed Board of Governors, to force the FOMC to lower rates quicker than they otherwise would have? And there is. So there's an arbitrage that they can allow the banks to do versus the Fed, which basically means if they lower their interest rates on excess reserves well below Fed funds and the discount window rate, this allows a large bank like JP Morgan to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, and then they take that and they lend it out at Fed funds, essentially the secured overnight funding rate, SOFR. And this is an arbitrage which will essentially mean the Fed is going to print money and hand it to the banks. Now, obviously, this is not politically palatable, so what the FOMC will be forced to do is lower the rate on Fed funds to match the interest rate on excess reserves. And in this way, Trump, using control of the Board of Governors, can influence the FOMC to do what he likes, even if they are in opposition to him. And so this is very critical here. How do we go from control of the Board of Governors, he's got 4 out of 7 seats, to control of the FOMC and the balance sheet? So there are 12 district banks, Fed district banks. This is back in America when they are more of an agrarian economy. Every bank set interest rates for the different districts who made different things in the American economy. There's 12 of these. Each bank president must be approved by the Board of Governors, and there are 12 of these bank presidents. They rotate as voting members on the FOMC. 5 out of 12 of them vote every year, and with a permanent seat coming from the New York Fed. Now, in 2026, in February, all 12 bank presidents must be reelected. And to be reelected means that your board, Class B and C directors, must vote in a simple majority to nominate you as a president. And then finally, the Board of Governors must approve that nomination, which means that Trump has control over who gets elected as a bank president through his control of the Board of Governors. It's a bit hard to see, but this is basically all the names of the folks who are up for re-election. And the point I'm trying to make here is, and you can see this in an essay that I published a few days ago. If you look at the type of people that these are, they're CEOs of banks and of large industrial companies. And what do we know about banks and companies? They love it when interest rates are lower, and they love it when more money is printed. So from their own selfish needs as economic actors, they would rather have the Fed have very easy monetary policy. So I can't see them going against Trump if he says, I only want people who are going to cut interest rates and increase the balance sheet to be nominated for president of these banks. And so this is how Trump gets control of the FOMC. He now has the Board of Governors who are only going to approve bank presidents who are sympathetic to his needs for easier monetary policy. And if he gets 3 out of 5 of these new bank presidents to vote his way, then he now has 7 members on the FOMC. And even if Jerome Powell is resolutely opposed to easier monetary policy, Trump can vote through what he wants. And so what he can do is he can stop quantitative tightening, the reduction of the balance sheet. He can restart quantitative easing, the increase of the balance sheet, and buy government bonds until the yield is low enough and Bessina says, okay, I like it there. And they essentially can create the Treasury and Fed Accords of 2025. And this is the yield curve control that I've been speaking about for a very long time. And so how does this mean anything to us as crypto investors? So we know that Bitcoin since 2009 has been the best performing asset in human history. We also know that every single central bank, including the Fed, has been printing money in trillions of dollars, yen, euro, won, whatever, since 2008 global financial crisis. And so what the mental idea is, okay, well, let's assume that we're going to yield curve control in America. How high could Bitcoin go? So I estimate that between now and the end of 2028, the U.S. Treasury will need to refinance and issue debt to fund the federal deficit in the size of about $15.3 trillion. The Fed, doing its job as a money printer, will buy about 50% of these bonds. During COVID, the Fed bought about 40 to 45% of all debt issued by the Treasury, as foreign central banks would prefer to own gold rather than Treasury bonds and notes. I think that this percentage of ownership will go even higher. So the Fed was going to almost double their balance sheet and add an additional $7.7 trillion of credit to the global financial markets. Okay, so that happens. What about Bitcoin? What about bank credit growth? I talked about these small banks who are going to issue more credit to fund industry. How much are they going to issue? During COVID, the banks, when Trump won and then Biden won, were focusing on the small banks. They issued about $2.5 trillion of new credit. And you can look at this number. Every week the Fed publishes it. It's called Other Deposits and Liabilities for the Banking System. And so I just took a straight line extrapolation and said that Trump is going to do this each year for the next 3 years, and that gets us to about $7.5 trillion of bank credit growth creation for a total of about $15.2 trillion of new dollars created between now and 2028, just due to the Fed engaging in yield curve control in conjunction with Scott Bessent at the Treasury. And so, during the COVID times, the Bitcoin price slope, percentage growth slope versus how much credit was created was about 0.19. I applied this to the current price at the time I wrote this, about $115,000, and that gets us to a ridiculous number of $3.4 million per Bitcoin. I don't believe that we're going to get to that level, but I think the magnitude of credit creation tells us that we're going to get a very large rise in the aggregate value of Bitcoin and crypto between now and 2028. And so that's why I have confidence that as Trump, who needs to fund his war effort, will take over the Fed in these bureaucratic methods that I described. We will print money using yield curve control, and Bitcoin can get to $1 million by 2028. Thank you.